The unseen. My upbringing was a little unorthodox. I grew up in a Southern Baptist household, the kind where we didn't believe in ghosts but were absolutely certain about demons. Let me explain. If something strange happened, it wasn't a spirit or a wandering soul, it was something darker, something biblical. I never fully bought into it, but the message was drilled into me from a young age. Rejecting demons meant rejecting scripture itself. My mother, though, was different. Faith was optional for her. She wasn't atheist or agnostic, just indifferent. She'd say things like, "God and I have an understanding," whenever I pressed her about church. While I leaned into religion as a source of structure and stability, she drifted further from it. It was one of the many things that widened the gap between us. I won't sugarcoat it. My mother struggled with addiction and mental health issues, things she never wanted help for. Some days she was functional, others she was downright insane. I tried not to take it personally, but it was hard. Looking back, she definitely had schizophrenia or some kind of adjacent condition. But before you say anything about my family being neglectful of her mental health, it was a different time back then. One afternoon I had a nightmare so vivid that I still remember every detail to this day. In the dream, I was lying in bed when my mother stormed into my room, screaming in a fit of rage. She grabbed me by the wrist and started shaking me violently. I woke up in a pool of sweat, my body still rigid with fear. But before I could shake off the dream, it happened again. Except this time, I wasn't asleep. The door barged open, and there she was, just as she had been in my nightmare. Same expression, same unhinged anger, same words. It was like the dream had been some kind of prophecy. I barely managed to push her off and yell for her to stop, and then it was over. She left as suddenly as she had entered, and when I confronted her the next morning, she had no memory of it. She seemed confused, even a little hurt that I was so shaken. I told myself it was a coincidence, some bizarre overlap between my subconscious and her moods. But part of me wondered if it was something worse. A few weeks later, I heard her screaming from the backyard. It was a strange sound, not a panicked scream or even a distressed one. The scream sounded more excited. I don't even know if that makes sense, but that's the best way I can describe it. I rushed outside and froze at what I saw. My mother was standing in the yard, grinning, holding a massive 7-foot-long snake in her bare hands. That was terrifying enough on its own, but there's something you don't know, which made it even worse. My mother had a lifelong phobia of snakes. She couldn't even look at them on TV without recoiling. But there she was, gripping one like it was a toy. "Come here," she said, motioning for me to grab the snake. I took a step back, shaking my head. I literally said, "Mom, what the hell?" But the look in her eye told me she couldn't even understand the words I was saying. She just smiled wider and tilted her head, like she was trying to scare me. I couldn't deal with it. I turned and ran back inside, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding. I peeked out the window and saw her still standing there, holding the snake like an offering. Eventually, she let it slither onto the ground and walked back inside as if nothing had happened. Later, when I asked her about it, she shrugged like I was making it up. She told me I must have had a strange dream and refused to entertain me when I continued to ask about it. That was nothing compared to what I'm about to tell you, though. That winter, my church held an overnight lock-in. I was relieved to go. Church was my escape, a place where I could be around predictable, normal people. My mother dropped me off, completely sober, and even kissed my forehead before driving away. At around 4:30 a.m., just as we were settling into sleep, A loud knocking echoed through the chapel. We all sat up, glancing at each other. The knocking moved, travelling around the building in an impossible way. At times it sounded like it was coming from multiple directions at once. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. It was rhythmic, circling the chapel like someone or something was trying to break in. The pastor, the only one with a key, was asleep in his office and hadn't heard a thing. I ran to wake him, and as soon as he stepped into the chapel, the knocking stopped. He opened the front doors and literally stumbled back in fear. Standing there, barefoot and sweating in the freezing air, was my mother. Her clothes were disheveled, and her hair was dripping with sweat. Her lips were moving, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. She didn't acknowledge the pastor. Her eyes locked on me immediately, and a slow, unsettling smile stretched across her face as she walked toward me. I wanted to run. The pastor tried to hold me back, whispering, "Stay here," but I felt completely powerless, like I had no choice but to go with her. I climbed into the car, afraid that she was going to do something, but she didn't. The drive home was silent. She didn't speak, didn't explain. She didn't answer when I asked why she was there. When we got home, she stopped in the doorway and just stared at me. She stood there silently, watching me as I walked to my room. I closed the door, locked it, and lay awake for hours, listening. In the morning, she was in the kitchen cooking breakfast. She was cheerful and clearly oblivious to what had happened the night before. She jumped back when she saw me, saying she was just about to pick me up from the church. I felt the blood drain from my face. She had no memory of knocking on the church doors, no memory of driving me home. It was freaky. I expected someone, the pastor, a church elder, even one of the chaperones, to say something about what had happened, but no one did. It was like they didn't know what to make of it, or worse, they didn't want to. That's kind of the way people treated my mum back then. That was decades ago. She's gone now, but her memory is something that will never leave me, for better or for worse. I don't know if I believe in demons or the supernatural anymore, but I can't explain what happened. The logical explanation is that she was suffering from mental illness, maybe addiction withdrawal, or maybe something else entirely. But the memory lapses, the eerie timing, the way she acted like a different person, some nights, it still haunts me. I tell myself there's a rational answer for all of it, but even now, I'm not sure I believe that. The years passed, and I moved away from home, leaving behind the small town and its suffocating memories. I built a life for myself, one far removed from the chaos of my childhood. But no matter how far I ran, the past had a way of creeping back in. It started with the dreams. At first they were fleeting, fragments of my mother's face, her voice echoing in the darkness. But as time went on, the dreams became more vivid, more unsettling. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, convinced that she was in the room with me. I told myself it was just stress, the lingering trauma of my upbringing. But deep down, I knew it was something more. One night, the dream was different. I was back in my childhood home, standing in the living room. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. My mother was there, but she wasn't alone. Surrounding her were shadowy figures, their faces obscured by darkness. They moved with an unnatural grace, circling her like predators closing in on their prey. My mother's eyes were wide with terror, her mouth opening in a silent scream. And then, as if sensing my presence, she turned to me and whispered, "Help me." I woke up gasping for air, my sheets tangled around me. The room was silent, but the feeling of dread lingered. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a dream. But as I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next morning, I received a call from my aunt. My mother had passed away in her sleep. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. Despite everything, she was still my mother, and a part of me had always hoped that one day we'd find a way to reconcile. Now, that chance was gone. I returned to my hometown for the funeral. The house felt smaller than I remembered, the walls closing in on me as I stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of flowers and grief. My aunt greeted me with a tight hug, her eyes red from crying. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. I nodded, unable to find the words. The house was filled with relatives and friends, their voices a low murmur as they shared stories about my mother. I listened, but their words felt distant, like they were talking about a stranger. That night, as I lay in my old bed, the dreams returned. This time I was standing in the backyard, the moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. My mother was there, her back to me. She was holding something in her hands, but I couldn't see what it was. As I approached, she turned to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. "They're coming," she whispered. Before I could respond, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The shadows around us shifted, taking on a life of their own. They reached out, their forms twisting and contorting as they closed in on us. My mother's face twisted in terror as the shadows engulfed her, pulling her into the darkness. I woke up screaming, my heart racing. The room was silent, but the feeling of dread was overwhelming. I grabbed my phone and dialed my aunt's number, my hands trembling. "Aunt Linda," I said when she answered, "I need to talk to you about Mom." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What about her?" she finally asked. Did she ever talk about seeing things? Shadows or something else?" Another pause. "Your mother had a lot of struggles," she said carefully, "but she never talked about anything like that. Why do you ask?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "I've been having these dreams about her, and I can't shake the feeling that something's not right." My aunt sighed. "I think it's just grief, honey. Losing someone is hard, especially when there's so much left unsaid. But your mother, she's at peace now." I wanted to believe her, but the dreams kept coming. Night after night, I found myself back in that house, surrounded by shadows and whispers. And each time, my mother's voice grew more desperate, more pleading. "They're coming," she would say. "You have to stop them." One night, I decided to confront the dreams head on. I closed my eyes and focused on the image of my mother, willing myself to stay in the dream, to find out what she was trying to tell me. The moment I drifted off, I was back in the house. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the shadows were more pronounced than ever. My mother was there, her face pale and drawn. "You have to listen," she said, her voice trembling. "They're not just dreams. They're warnings." "Warnings about what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The unseen," she said. "They've been watching us for years, waiting, and now that I'm gone, they're coming for you." Before I could respond, the shadows surged forward, engulfing her once again. I woke up gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was silent, but the feeling of dread was overwhelming. I knew then that I couldn't ignore the dreams any longer. I had to find out what my mother was trying to tell me. I spent the next few days researching, scouring the internet for any information I could find about the unseen. But no matter how much I searched, I couldn't find anything that matched what my mother had described. Frustrated, I decided to visit the local library. If there was any information to be found, it would be there. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, greeted me as I entered. "Can I help you find something?" she asked. "I'm looking for information about something called the Unseen," I said, feeling a little foolish. The librarian's expression changed, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The Unseen," she repeated slowly. "That's not a term I've heard in a long time." My heart skipped a beat. "You've heard of it?" She nodded. "It's an old legend, something the locals used to talk about back in the day. They said the unseen was spirits, dark entities that preyed on the vulnerable. They'd latch onto someone, feeding off their fear and despair until there was nothing left. "How do you stop them?" I asked, my voice trembling. The librarian shook her head. "I don't know. The stories say that once they've chosen their target, there's no escaping them. But there was one woman. She claimed to have found a way to banish them. She said it required a sacrifice, something precious to the person being targeted." I left the library with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. I had to find a way to stop the unseen before it was too late. That night, I prepared myself for the dream. I lit a candle and placed it on the nightstand, hoping its light would guide me through the darkness. As I closed my eyes, I focused on my mother's face, willing myself to stay in the dream. The moment I drifted off, I was back in the house. The shadows were thicker than ever, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed in on me. My mother was there, her face filled with desperation. "You have to do it," she said. "You have to make the sacrifice." "What sacrifice?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Something precious," she said, "something you can't bear to lose." I woke up with a start, my heart racing. The candle had burned down to a stub, its flame flickering weakly. I knew what I had to do. I reached into the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was the only picture I had of my mother and me together, taken when I was just a child. It was the only thing I had left of her, the only thing that connected me to the woman she had once been. I held the photograph in my hands, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry, Mum," I whispered. "I hope this is enough." I lit a match and held it to the corner of the photograph, watching as the flames consumed the image of my mother and me. As the last ember faded, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. The dreams were gone, and with them, the shadows that had haunted me for so long. But as I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. And I knew, deep down, that the unseen were never truly gone. They were just waiting for their next opportunity to strike.